You are pulled over on a dead quiet stretch of highway at 2 in the morning, and the officer tapping his heavy flashlight against your glass doesn't want your license. He wants your dignity, your freedom, and the cash hidden in your trunk. He smiles, a predator playing with his food in the dark, completely unaware that the man gripping the steering wheel isn't a helpless victim. What Roy Callahan did not know, could not have known sitting in that brush in the dark at mile marker 31, was that the car he was about to follow had been waiting for him for 14 months, and the man behind the wheel was the one person in the state with the authority, the evidence, and the very personal reason to end everything Roy Callahan had built on this road. Stick around, because what happens next is going to leave you breathless. The pine trees on either side of State Route 77 didn't sway that night, because there was no wind, and that stillness made the darkness feel even heavier than usual. The kind of thick, swallowing dark that pressed against your windshield like something alive and waiting, something that had been there long before the road was paved and would be there long after the asphalt crumbled back into dirt. There were no streetlights on this stretch of Route 77, hadn't been for as long as anyone in Oak Ridge County could remember, and the county commissioners had never seen fit to change that, which meant that after the last gas station faded out around mile marker 19, you were on your own for the next 30 miles of two-lane blacktop, winding through the pine-choked heart of the county. No cell service, no pull-offs with emergency phones, just the road and the trees and whatever was hiding in the darkness between them. Deputy Roy Callahan had been sitting in his blacked-out Dodge Charger at mile marker 31 for 47 minutes, the engine idling low enough that the sound barely carried past the tree line, a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee wedged between his thigh and the door, his eyes fixed on the pale ribbon of road visible through the gap in the brush, where he had nosed the front of the cruiser just far enough to see without being seen, which was a skill he had always thought that nobody taught you at the academy, but that you either had or you didn't, and Roy Callahan had always had it. He was 46 years old, 18 years on the force 12 of them in Oak Ridge County, and the weight of all that time sat on him the particular way it sits on men who have spent their careers operating in the dark. Not the dramatic darkness of war or crisis, but the routine darkness of the small hours, the quiet authority of being the only badge within 6 miles in any direction, the certainty that what happened on this road between midnight and dawn was his to define. His voice, people noticed, dropped lower when he felt in control of a situation, quieter rather than louder, which made it somehow more frightening than shouting, because it communicated that the man speaking had nothing to prove and nothing to fear and nothing that needed raising. His father had been a cop. His older brother had been a cop. Somewhere along the way, somewhere in the years between his first day on patrol and this particular Tuesday night at mile marker 31, the belief that a badge was a promise had curdled into something uglier and far more practical. The understanding that the badge wasn't a promise at all, but a tool, and like any tool, it was only as honest as the hand that held it. He shifted in his seat, rolled his thick neck until it popped on the left side, and reached up with his right thumb to find the edge of his badge where it was pinned to his chest, lifting it slightly off the fabric and letting it drop back down with the faintest click of metal. A habit he had developed sometime in the last few years, without ever being entirely conscious of it. A small ritual of reassurance that the thing was still there, still solid, still real. Down the road, a faint glimmer appeared in the darkness, the distant bloom of headlights rounding the long curve at mile marker 28, and Callahan straightened in his seat with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had done this exact thing so many times that the anticipation had become almost comfortable, almost domestic, the way another man might straighten before answering a phone. He knew was ringing with good news. He watched the headlights grow, watched them resolve from a blur into 2 separate beams, steady and properly aimed, moving at what looked like the right speed. And he leaned forward just slightly in his seat and thought, without any particular heat or excitement, The way you think of a thing so routine, it barely needs thinking at all. Another Tuesday, another contribution to the county fund. 6 weeks earlier, on a Thursday night in early October, when the temperature on Route 77 had dropped just enough to make the air smell like pine sap, and coming winter Earl Mosley had been driving his 2009 Ford F-150 South through Oak Ridge County, with all the careful attention of a man who understood that careful attention was his only real protection. Earl was 51 years old, a machinist from Richmond, Virginia, with wide hands calloused from 30 years at the same plant, and a face that carried the particular dignity of a man who had spent his whole life doing exactly what was asked of him, and slightly more. And he was driving to his mother's house in Macon, Georgia, because she was scheduled for a hip replacement the following morning, and he was the oldest son. And in the Mosley family that meant something specific and non-negotiable about who showed up when someone needed showing up for. The $4,200 in his center console was in a white envelope, slightly worn at the corner from being handled, because it had passed through 6 sets of hands before it reached Earl's, all of it gathered over the previous 3 weeks to cover what Medicare wouldn't cover, and Earl had declined every offer to wire it because his mother didn't trust electronic money. And frankly, neither did Earl. And so here it was in a white envelope in his center console, a family savings offered up for one reason and on its way to do exactly that one thing. He was doing 57 miles an hour, too, under the limit, because Earl Mosley had learned a long time ago that in certain parts of certain states, after a certain hour, doing exactly the speed limit read as suspicious, like you were working at it, so you went 2 under, and you kept your hands where they could be seen, and you drove like every mile was being graded, which on this particular road, on this particular night it was, though Earl didn't know that yet. The lights in his mirror came without warning. Just the sudden explosion of red and blue that seized his chest like a cold hand closing around his heart. And before the siren had finished its first short whoop, Earl was already pulling to the right, already running through the checklist that black men in America carried around in their heads, the way other people carried around grocery lists, hands visible, no sudden movements. Yes, sir. No, sir, be very clear about where everything is before you reach for it. Roy Callahan approached the truck with the unhurried stride of a man walking across a parking lot he owned, flashlight up and aimed at Earl's face through the driver's window, and he stood there for a long moment before saying anything at all, just the light in the night and the distant sound of something moving in the trees. And when he finally spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who had given this speech so many times, it had stopped being a speech and become a kind of weather low and flat and completely certain of itself. He smelled marijuana, he said, and Earl said there was no. Marijuana had never been. Marijuana would never be marijuana in a vehicle belonging to a man who had spent 30 years in a plant with random drug testing on a rotating schedule. And Callahan nodded like he was considering this very seriously, and then asked Earl to step out of the vehicle anyway. And Earl stepped out, and the search of the truck took 11 minutes, and found exactly nothing. And then Callahan found the envelope in the center console. The 2 choices came in the same quiet conversational tone Callahan used for everything, the way you'd explain a bus schedule or a return policy to someone who hadn't read the fine print. And Earl stood on the gravel shoulder of Route 77 in the cold October air and looked at the waiver form and then at the badge and then at the form again, and understood that the badge and the form meant the same thing in this moment, which was that he had no real choice at all, and his hand shook when he signed it, shook badly enough that his signature looked like it had been written by a man twice his age in the middle of a stroke. Callahan took the envelope, tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket with the same casual ease with which you'd pocket a receipt, reached up and lifted his badge with his thumb and let it fall against his chest with its small metallic click, and turned back toward his cruiser without another word, without looking back, leaving Earl standing alone on the shoulder of a road where nothing moved and nothing was coming, and the only light was the diminishing red glow of Callahan's taillights pulling away into the dark. Earl sat in his truck on the shoulder of Route 77 for 22 minutes before he could make himself start the engine because he was doing the arithmetic of the phone call he was going to have to make to his brother and his sister, and also because he was doing a different, harder arithmetic, the one about what kind of country this was and what a man's dignity was worth in it, and whether there was any point in telling anyone what had just happened. And by the time he pulled back onto the road, he had completed both calculations, and the answer to neither one made him feel anything close to okay. 2 weeks before the night that would change everything, Captain Sandra Okafor spread a topographic map of Oak Ridge County across the conference table in the State Police Internal Affairs Division, and the map was covered in small red circles that clustered along Route 77, the way rust clusters on metal left too long in the rain, each circle representing a reported or suspected stop. And there were 41 circles on the map, and Okafor believed that number was less than half the real number, because the real number included everyone who had been too frightened or too isolated or too certain that nothing would come of reporting it to ever pick up a phone. 14 months, she said to Marcus Webb, who was sitting across the table from her, with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving slowly across the map, taking it in the way a man takes in something he has been waiting to see for a long time, something he has been carrying the shape of in his chest, without the actual image to fill it. And 14 months meant 41 documented victims, and likely 90 or more undocumented ones. All of them, black or Hispanic. All of them traveling alone. Almost all of them carrying cash for reasons that were entirely legitimate and entirely explainable and entirely irrelevant to Roy Callahan. The pattern had a grammar to it. Okafor explained, tapping each cluster of red circles in sequence. The stops happened between midnight and 4 in the morning, always on the Route 77 corridor between mile markers 19 and 38. Always single-occupant vehicles, always out-of-state plates or vehicles with minor registration issues that gave a determined cop an opening, and always involving cash, which suggested that Callahan had simply been doing this long enough that his instincts for identifying a profitable target had sharpened into something close to expertise. 3 formal complaints had been filed with the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department in the previous 18 months, and all 3 had been closed without investigation, 2 of them within 48 hours of being filed, which meant the rot didn't stop at Callahan, which meant Callahan had cover from above, which was why Internal Affairs, and not the county's own oversight mechanism, was sitting in this room with this map on this afternoon. Marcus Webb looked at the map and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough that Okafor let it stretch, because she had worked with Marcus for 3 years, and she understood that his silences were not the silences of someone who had nothing to say, but the silences of someone who was being very careful about how much they were going to say. And she watched his eyes stop moving and settle on a specific cluster of red circles centered on mile marker 31. And she waited. He pointed at it and said quietly that he knew this road, and Okafor said she knew he did, and that was part of why she had chosen him for this operation. And Marcus nodded and didn't say what both of them understood was sitting behind that nod, which was that his younger brother James had been stopped at mile marker 31 2 years and 3 months ago and had lost $6,800 in cash to a deputy, whose name James had only later found out was Callahan money that had been intended as a down payment on a house that James and his wife had spent 4 years saving for money that James had not reported as stolen, because Callahan had told him that if he reported it, he would be charged with drug trafficking, and James had believed him because James understood with the clarity that comes from having grown up black in America that being believed was a luxury he could not count on in a sheriff's department in Oak Ridge County. Marcus had not told Okafor any of this when she first assigned him to Operation Duskline, and he didn't tell her now because the operation needed him to be a professional and not a brother. And he was good enough at his job to know the difference, and disciplined enough to hold that line even when holding it cost him something. The plan was clean and familiar in its architecture. A bait vehicle with a registered fictitious identity, a wire worn against the skin, $21,000 in marked sequential $50 bills in a gym bag in the trunk, GPS tracking under the frame, and a backup team holding position on Interstate 46 miles north of the target zone. Close enough to respond in under 4 minutes, but far enough to be invisible until the moment they were needed. And Marcus listened to all of it and asked one question when Okafor was finished. He asked if this time they were going to get all the way to the top, not just the man on the road, but the structure behind the man, the ledgers and the accounts and the names above Callahan in the chain. And Okafor looked at him steadily across the map with all its red circles and said, "That's exactly why I picked you." At 11:30 on a Tuesday night, Marcus Webb sat in a prep room at State Police Headquarters while a tech specialist pressed a microtransmitter against his sternum and ran thin wire leads along his rib cage before smoothing adhesive over the whole assembly with the careful expressionless concentration of a man who did this the way other people change oil competently and without ceremony. And Marcus breathed shallow while the specialist worked because the adhesive needed to lay flat, and any movement of the chest before it set would create a ridge under the fabric of the shirt. The vehicle, waiting in the parking structure below, was a 2015 Chevrolet Malibu in dark navy blue, the kind of navy that read as almost black under certain light and almost gray under other light, registered under the name Daniel Reeves, a freelance contractor from out of state with a clean record, except for a license suspension 6 years ago that had since been resolved, which was just enough of a smudge to give a motivated officer something to work with if he was already looking. In the trunk inside a gym bag, chosen specifically because it communicated moderate income and regular use, and nothing dramatic, was $21,000 in marked sequential $50 bills, arranged in 3 stacks and placed in the bag without any effort to conceal them. Because the point was not concealment, the point was discovery. The point was that whoever opened that trunk would find them within 30 seconds of looking. Marcus pulled a faded denim jacket over the wire assembly and checked in the mirror to confirm that the transmitter left no visible line through the fabric. And the man in the mirror looked back at him with the specific expression of someone who is about to spend the next several hours being a slightly different version of himself in a situation where the difference matters enormously. He thought about James then the way he always did in the minutes before an operation, when there was nothing left to prepare and nothing left to do but think. And what he thought about specifically was the way James had told him the story of that night, 2 years ago, sitting at Marcus's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, telling it in a flat matter-of-fact voice that was so careful and so controlled that it communicated everything it was trying not to communicate. Telling it with his eyes, not quite meeting Marcus's in the way. Eyes don't quite meet when someone is describing a humiliation they haven't finished processing. And what Marcus remembered most from that conversation was not any particular detail of the stop itself, but the moment James looked up and said very quietly that the worst part wasn't the money, that the worst part was signing that waiver was having no other real choice, and knowing it was walking away from that road with the certain, bone-deep knowledge that the system that was supposed to protect him had just used him instead. Marcus took one more look in the mirror, buttoned the last button on the jacket and went downstairs to the dark blue Malibu, and he settled into the driver's seat and confirmed the GPS indicator was showing a solid green signal. And then he sat there for a moment in the silence of the parking structure, with his hands on the wheel and the engine not yet running, holding a space between where he was and where he was going. At 12:02 in the morning, Marcus Webb started the engine and pulled out of the parking structure and turned south toward Route 77, and he drove without music and without the radio and without anything between him and the dark road ahead, except 17 years of learning how to hold himself still under pressure, and the wire taped flat against his chest, and the ghost of a conversation at a kitchen table that had been sitting in him for 2 years, like a splinter that had never quite worked its way out. Marcus held the Malibu at 57 miles an hour with the cruise control set, and his hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, and his eyes on the road ahead, not on the mirrors, because a man who checked his mirrors too often on a dark highway was a man who knew he might be followed. And Daniel Reeves had no reason to expect to be followed, was just a man driving south through a county he didn't live in on his way to somewhere else, tired and unremarkable and just trying to cover the miles. The road on this stretch was a kind of sensory deprivation. No light from above, no light from the sides, just the tunnel of the Malibu's own headlights, cutting a pale wedge into the dark ahead, and the towering walls of pine on either side so close that when the occasional light crosswind moved through them, you could hear the branches against each other in a sound like distant applause, and the asphalt itself was the worn gray of road that hasn't been repaved in years, cracked along the shoulders and patched down the center line in ways that created a subtle, rhythmic vibration through the frame of the car that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. In his right ear, the small receiver carried Okafor's voice. "Thermal. Has him at mile 29. She said, her voice even and professional. "He's been stationary for 40 minutes, pulled off into the brush. Right side, you'll pass his position in approximately 90 seconds. Keep your speed exactly where it is." And Marcus said copy in a voice barely above a breath. He did not look in the mirror as he passed mile marker 30, did not check for the silhouette in the brush, because Daniel Reeves wouldn't know to look, and what he felt instead of looking was a faint change in the air pressure behind the vehicle, as something that had been sitting still began to move, the almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere that a predator creates when it leaves cover. And Marcus had felt this thing before in other operations on other roads, and he had never been entirely able to explain it, except to say that the human body, when it has spent enough time in enough dangerous situations, develops sensors that have nothing to do with the 5 conventional ones. 2 miles. Okafor said he's maintaining distance, not closing yet. Running your plates, and Marcus said nothing. Kept the needle on 57, kept his breathing slow and regular. The way you kept it, slow and regular, when something very important was balanced on the razor edge of the next several minutes. The interior of the Malibu lit up in red and blue, the colors washing across the dashboard, and the headliner and the backs of Marcus's hands on the wheel, and the siren gave one short, sharp chirp. Aggressive and businesslike, not the long wail of an emergency, but the quick assertion of authority that says, "You here now," and Marcus felt something that was not exactly fear and not exactly anticipation, but occupied the same neural real estate as both. He said quietly, "Showtime, Cap. He's lit me up," and he engaged the right turn signal smooth and unhurried and guided the Malibu onto the gravel shoulder and put it in park, and turned off the engine and rolled down the window and placed his hands on the steering wheel with his fingers spread wide, and he waited. From the driver's side mirror, Marcus watched the door of the Charger swing open, and Roy Callahan step out into the night air with the deliberate unhurry of a man for whom this moment was simply the next thing in a familiar sequence. And Callahan stood behind the open door of his cruiser for a full 90 seconds before he moved, which Marcus knew was not hesitation but theater. The strobe lights working on the nervous system of the driver ahead of him, the way pressure works on a bruise, steady and building, designed to make the waiting itself feel like the beginning of something bad. Callahan came around the back of the Malibu and tapped his flashlight against the driver's side taillight. As he passed it, a sharp, forceful tap that rattled the plastic housing and served no law enforcement purpose whatsoever, except to announce that he was comfortable making impact with your property before he had said a single word to you, and Marcus registered the sound and noted it and filed it. The flashlight came up and went directly into Marcus's face through the driver's window, the beam close enough and bright enough to be genuinely blinding, and Marcus turned his head slightly and raised one hand to shield his eyes, and said in a voice pitched carefully to carry the particular register of a man who is trying to be cooperative and slightly confused, and not at all threatening, "Officer, is there a problem?" Callahan said nothing for 4 seconds, just stood there with the light in Marcus's face, and then he said in that low, flat voice, You're a long way from home at this hour." And it wasn't a question, was a statement offered with the confidence of a man who had already made several decisions about who was sitting in this car and why. And Marcus said he was driving down to Augusta to see about his brother, who had been having some health problems, just trying to beat the morning traffic. "License and registration," Callahan said. And Marcus reached for the sun visor with the telegraphed, unhurried movements of a man who has thought carefully about every motion he makes in the presence of an officer at night, extracting the fake documents and holding them out the window, and Callahan took them and read the name aloud, Daniel Reeves, the way you taste something you're not sure about. He said he'd clocked Marcus at 71 and a 55, and had observed the vehicle crossing the center line twice, which were both lies. And Marcus said, "I don't think I was doing more than the limit, sir. I had the cruise on. I've been driving for 6 hours, and I'm being real careful," and Callahan said, "You think wrong." Then he leaned in closer to the window, close enough that Marcus could smell stale coffee and a sharpness that might have been tobacco, and he inhaled with deliberate exaggeration with the performance of a man who has decided what he's smelling before he smells it, and said he was detecting a very distinct odor of unburned marijuana coming from the vehicle. Marcus let some real edge come into his voice, the kind of edge that emerges naturally in an innocent person who has just been told their car smells like something they know for certain. "It doesn't smell like, sir. That's not possible. There are no drugs in this car. I don't smoke. I never have." And Callahan's hand dropped from the roof of the Malibu to rest on the grip of his sidearm, not drawing it, just touching it, letting the touch say what words would have made too explicit. And he said, "Are you calling me a liar?" Marcus said no, sir, said he was just saying he didn't know what the officer was smelling. And Callahan said, "Step out of the vehicle." And Marcus said, "Please, officer, I'm just trying to get to my brother. I haven't done anything." And Callahan said it again. Step out of the vehicle with the flat repetition of a man who has run out of patience for a performance he didn't find convincing anyway. Rookie Deputy Marcus Novak, 27 years old. 3 months out of the academy, had parked his cruiser 30 yards back when Callahan called in the stop, and now he stood by the front quarter panel of his own vehicle with his hands on his belt, and his eyes pointed at the road surface between his feet, not at the man being pulled from the car. Not at Callahan, specifically at nothing, with the studied neutrality of someone who is trying very hard to be both present and absent, simultaneously to bear witness without being a witness. The pat-down lasted 4 minutes and was aggressively thorough in a way that had nothing to do with officer safety and everything to do with the psychology of dominance. Callahan's hands going through every pocket and along every seam with a force and a lack of ceremony that communicated very clearly that the person being searched was not a person in any of the ways that mattered in this interaction. And the hands did not find the wire because the wire was taped flat against Marcus's sternum under 2 layers of adhesive and a shirt he hadn't tucked in, and they found nothing else because there was nothing else to find. Callahan told Marcus to go sit on the bumper of the cruiser, illuminated by the headlights, and framed perfectly for the dash cam of Callahan's own vehicle, which was recording everything from an angle that would later prove extremely useful. And Marcus walked back and sat on the cold steel of the push bumper and watched Roy Callahan begin to take apart the Malibu with the efficient certainty of a man who was completely sure he was about to find what he was looking for. The moment Roy Callahan opened the trunk of the Malibu and saw the gym bag, a stillness came over him that was different from all the deliberate stillness that had come before it. And Marcus, watching from 30 feet away on the bumper of the cruiser, recognized the specific quality of that stillness. Because he had seen it before in other operations, the stillness of a man whose nervous system has just received exactly the information it was hoping for. Callahan unzipped the bag, looked at what was inside, and zipped it back up, and the whole thing took about 8 seconds, and then he picked up the bag and carried it back to where Marcus was sitting and set it down on the gravel between them, with a sound that was heavier than it had any right to be, a thump that seemed to come up through the ground, as much as from the bag itself. and he stood there looking at Marcus with an expression that Marcus could only describe as satisfaction. The aggressive bark was entirely gone, replaced by something quieter, and in its own way much more dangerous. A conversational menace, the tone of a man who no longer needed to perform authority because the situation had resolved itself in his favor. And Callahan crouched slightly on his heels and looked at Marcus, and he said, "Smart people keep their money in banks, and only two kinds of people drive at 1 in the morning with 20 grand in a gym bag. People running from something, or people carrying something, and either way tonight it becomes county property." Marcus let his shoulders drop, let the exhaustion and the fear that Daniel Reeves would have been feeling come through in his body language, and he said that the money was his brother's, that he'd been helping cover costs. The insurance wasn't going to touch, and Callahan listened to this with the careful attention of a man who is not listening at all, who is waiting for the sentence to end so that he can say what he was going to say before it began. Then Callahan said he was going to give Marcus a choice, and he said it the way you explain something to someone who has missed the point of a conversation that ended several minutes ago, with a patience that was itself a form of contempt. And he laid out choice number 1, which was the arrest, the charges, the impound, the 6-month wait in the county lockup for a hearing, the guaranteed loss of the money and the car, and any realistic hope of getting either back, and then he laid out choice number 2, which was the waiver, the signature, the bag in his trunk, the drive to Augusta, the gratitude that ought to accompany getting to sleep in a bed tonight instead of a cage. He produced a printed form from the back pocket of his uniform pants, the kind of form that has been used so many times. It shows where at the fold lines that has been signed in the dark, on the hoods of cars and on the roofs of trunks, by dozens of people on dozens of nights on this road. And he held it out toward Marcus along with a pen, and Marcus looked at the form. In his ear, barely audible, Okafor's voice said, "We have the explicit extortion, complete and clean green light whenever you're ready." And Marcus kept his eyes on the waiver, and did not visibly react to the voice in his ear, but something shifted in him at those words. Not relief, exactly, not triumph, exactly, something quieter and more specific than either of those. Something that had to do with the weight of 2 years, and a kitchen table, and a cup of coffee going cold, and his brother's eyes not quite meeting his. Callahan lifted his badge with his right thumb, the motion so habitual he probably wasn't conscious of it, lifted it and let it fall against his chest with its small metallic click, and extended the pen in the other hand toward Marcus. And Marcus looked at the pen, and then Marcus looked at Callahan, and the look he gave Callahan in that moment was the first entirely unperformed thing that had happened in this encounter, because it came from somewhere deeper than the operation, and deeper than the preparation. Marcus stood up from the bumper of the cruiser, not quickly, not dramatically. Just a man standing up from a seated position, a movement so ordinary and unremarkable that it took Callahan a full second to register that something had fundamentally changed, because the man standing in front of him no longer had the posture of Daniel Reeves, no longer had the rounded shoulders and the careful deference that had been present in every interaction since the stop began, and what replaced all of that was something so different and so complete that Callahan's hand went to his gun before his conscious mind had fully caught up with what his instincts were already telling him. "Deputy Roy Callahan," Marcus said, and his voice was no longer Daniel Reeves's voice at all, was the voice he used in interrogation rooms and courtrooms, flat and direct, and carrying the weight of a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to explain. Callahan's hand tightened on the grip of his weapon, and from behind Marcus came Novak's voice, cracked through with sudden adrenaline. "Hands up. Let me see your hands, don't move." And Marcus raised both hands slowly, to chest tight, palms out and fingers spread, and said "relax," and reached with 2 fingers into the left breast pocket of his denim jacket, and drew out a black leather badge wallet and flipped it open, and the gold shield of the State Police Internal Affairs Bureau caught the light of Callahan's own strobe lights and threw it back at him. "Detective Marcus Webb, State Police Internal Affairs," he said. "You're done, Roy." What happened to Callahan's face in the next 3 seconds was a process, rather than a single event, a sequence that began at the top and moved downward like something structural. Giving way, the color left his face first, not the flush leaving, but the actual color. The blood pulling back from the surface the way water pulls back, before a wave leaving him a grayish, papery pallor under the harsh lights. And then his jaw came unhinged slightly, the muscles holding it taut simply failing. The way muscles fail when the brain has stopped sending coherent instructions to them, and then his hand on the grip of his weapon began to shake. Not a small tremor, but a visible, uncontrolled shaking that communicated very clearly that the hand was no longer connected to any decision being made by the man it was attached to. Inside Callahan's head, in the space where language had briefly ceased to function, a sequence of memories arrived not as images but as sounds. And the first was his own voice saying, "Smart people keep their money in banks." And in the half-second after he heard himself say it, he understood with the finality of something breaking, that those words had been recorded, were on a wire, were at this exact moment being received by people he would never meet in a command vehicle 6 miles north on Interstate 40. And then he heard himself saying it, not once, but many times on many shoulders of many dark roads, to many people who had stood where Marcus was standing now. And he heard Earl Mosley's silence after he had signed the waiver, heard it, the way you hear something you weren't paying attention to at the time, and can only really hear in retrospect a silence that said, "Yes, this is the world. I know. This is the world." And he heard, underneath everything else, the voice of Sheriff Dale Pruitt saying 3 years ago in the parking lot behind the station, "No witnesses, no problems." And he understood that witnesses had just become something else entirely. 5 seconds of silence followed, in which the only sounds on Route 77 at mile marker 31 were the rhythmic click of the strobe lights, the faint movement of pine branches, and the very controlled, even breathing of Marcus Webb, who had stopped speaking because there was nothing more to say, and because the silence was doing work that words would only interrupt. Novak lowered his weapon. He looked at Callahan. He looked at the badge in Marcus's hand. He looked at Callahan again. And then he did something that required no words, and said everything that needed to be said. He removed both hands from his belt entirely, and placed them flat at his sides, away from his weapon, away from his radio. A small physical declaration that he was no longer standing in the same place he had been standing 60 seconds ago. Marcus reached up and tapped the receiver in his ear and said, "Captain, target is secure. Bring everyone." And then he lowered his hand and waited. And it took less than 10 seconds for the horizon at both ends of Route 77 to begin to bloom with light. Callahan's voice, when it came, was not the voice from the highway. Stops, it was smaller than any of those, and it said in something between a whisper and a question, "Please, I have a family." And Marcus looked at him for a moment with the whole weight of 2 years, and 41 red circles on a map and a kitchen table, and a cup of cold coffee behind his eyes. And then he said, "So did every man you robbed on this road," and he said it without heat, without satisfaction, simply as a fact that needed to exist in the world alongside all the other facts of this night. And then he said, "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The 6 vehicles came in fast and without sirens in the final 200 yards, cutting to just amber running lights as they decelerated onto the gravel shoulder. And by the time Roy Callahan had processed that they were there were already 8 officers deployed in a loose perimeter around both vehicles. And the thing that Callahan had depended on for 3 years, which was the isolation of this road and its freedom from consequence, had, in the space of 3 minutes, become the thing that made his situation completely and absolutely unrescuable. The cuffing was done quickly and professionally. 2 state troopers taking Callahan's arms with the practiced efficiency of people doing a job they have done many times, before the ratchet of the handcuffs snapping tight with a sound that Marcus registered somewhere below, Conscious thought a sound that was in some register of his nervous system deeply satisfying in a way that he was not going to spend any energy analyzing or apologizing for. Captain Okafor arrived in the third vehicle and walked past Callahan without giving him a single glance, which was not oversight but a specific message delivered in the language of professional dismissal, and came to stand beside Marcus near the rear of the Malibu, and Okafor looked at the gym bag being placed in an evidence bag and then at Marcus and gave him a single small nod. In the back of the transport van, through the small reinforced window in the rear doors, as the van prepared to pull away, Callahan looked out at the section of Route 77 visible from his position. The pale gravel, and the dark trees, and the patch of asphalt that had been until 40 minutes ago, the center of a world he controlled. And what he saw through that window was not a road, but an ending, a before and after line drawn across the geography of his life, and he would be on the wrong side of that line for the remaining 24 years of his sentence. The interrogation room at State Police Headquarters was exactly as Marcus had left it, 6 hours earlier. Gray walls under fluorescent light that buzzed at a frequency slightly below conscious perception, but registered nonetheless as a kind of low-grade irritation. A stainless steel table bolted to the floor with an eye bolt at the far end, 2 metal chairs on the interviewer's side, one on the subject's side, no windows, a camera mounted in the upper corner covering the whole room, and no comforts of any kind, which was the point, because the room was not designed for comfort, was designed to make the person sitting in the single chair feel the full weight of where they were and what had brought them there. Roy Callahan, sitting in that single chair, with his wrists cuffed to the eye bolt, and his tactical belt gone and his badge gone and his gun gone, looked substantially smaller than he had on Route 77, because the physical presence of a man like Callahan was substantially constructed from the things he wore and carried and the authority those things represented, and without them, what remained was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s, in a sweat-soaked gray undershirt with a leg bouncing under the table at a rate that communicated the velocity of the thoughts going through his head. Marcus and Okafor came in and sat down across from him without speaking, and the silence that followed lasted long enough to be uncomfortable in the specific way that interrogation silences are uncomfortable not because of what is in them, but because of what the subject fills them with from his own inventory of fear. And then Okafor reached forward and placed a small digital recorder on the table and pressed play. The voice that came out of the recorder was Callahan's voice, clear and composed, and dripping with the confident contempt it had carried in the darkness of Route 77. Smart people keep their money in banks. Only 2 kinds of people drive at 1 in the morning with 20 grand in a gym bag, people running from something or people carrying something, either way. Tonight it becomes county property, and Callahan listened to himself say it in this room, under these lights in front of these 2 people, and the color that had left his face on the highway did not return. Marcus listed the charges in the flat informational tone he used in interrogations, not reading them off, but reciting them from memory, because he had been building this case for 14 months. Hobbs Act extortion, carrying a federal minimum of 20 years. Deprivation of rights under color of law with 41 documented counts. Armed robbery on the basis that the visible sidearm constituted an implicit threat in each stop official misconduct. Wire fraud through the use of police radio equipment in the commission of the stops. And he said that the minimum federal sentence on the Hobbs Act alone was 22 years, and that a corrections officer and general population faced a specific and well-documented set of challenges that Marcus did not need to detail. Callahan said he wanted his union lawyer, and Okafor told him the union rep had been notified. 40 minutes ago had been given a summary of the charges, and had said, "I'm not driving to headquarters at 3 in the morning to defend a case. With this much recording evidence, I'll be there tomorrow afternoon." Callahan tried his last card then. He said this was entrapment. He said a state police detective driving a bait car and pretending to be frightened was manipulation, that no court would hold up an extortion charge against evidence obtained through that kind of deception. And he said it with enough conviction that Marcus could tell he had been rehearsing it in his head since The highway had been holding on to it as the thing that would save him. Marcus let him finish. Then he said without raising his voice, "Entrapment requires inducement. Roy, it requires that an officer planted the idea of a crime in the mind of someone who wouldn't otherwise have committed it. And he asked Callahan, who induced you to follow a car doing exactly the speed limit with both hands on the wheel and no lane deviations. Who induced you to claim you smelled marijuana that wasn't there. Who induced you to produce a waiver form from your back pocket, the kind of form that wears at the fold lines from being used so many times." And he waited while Callahan sat with those questions and watched the last usable piece of cover disappear from behind Callahan's eyes like smoke clearing from a room. In the silence that followed, Marcus said, "You're the man who stood on the road, the visible face of this operation. But we both know that a deputy's salary doesn't explain a 3-year extortion operation that netted somewhere north of $300,000, and we are interested in where the money went." And he said the name Dale Pruitt, sheriff of Oak Ridge County, and Callahan's legs stopped bouncing, which was more communicative than anything he could have said out loud. What Callahan told them over the next 30 minutes rearranged the scope of Operation Dusk Line from a case about a corrupt deputy into something significantly larger. The highway stops fed into a county discretionary fund controlled entirely by Sheriff Pruitt, and passed through accounts managed by County Commissioner Frank Bellamy, and there was a ledger. A physical ledger that Pruitt maintained with the obsessive precision of a man who trusted nothing to memory. And that ledger was in a floor safe in a hunting cabin at Lake Ridge, and it needed to be there in approximately 42 minutes, or Pruitt's chief deputy would check the drop, and the cabin would be cleaned, and the ledgers would be burned. Okafor was on her feet before Callahan had finished the last sentence, and she looked at Marcus and said, "Gear up, we're not waiting for morning." The 3 Bearcat tactical vehicles and 2 FBI Suburbans moved through the county roads at speeds that were only possible, because the roads were empty and the drivers were very good at what they did, lights off in the final 2 miles, engines cut in the last 300 yards to coast silently down the pine-lined dirt access road on nothing but gravity and momentum. And the night was cold enough now that the breath of the operators deploying from the rear hatches made small clouds in the air as they moved outward into their positions with the fluid practiced economy of people for whom silence is a professional requirement rather than an effort. Inside the lead vehicle, Marcus sat between Okafor and FBI Special Agent Diana Reyes, who was looking at a thermal imaging feed on a ruggedized laptop that showed the cabin from above the white heat signatures of the people inside it, glowing against the cold darkness of the surrounding forest. 4 heat signatures, Reyes said, and 3 vehicles, and the 3rd vehicle was a Lincoln Navigator registered to Dale Pruitt, which meant this was not a routine cash drop, but something more significant, a meeting. And the 4 signatures around what the thermal imaging identified as a table-height surface were arranged in a configuration that suggested they were facing each other, seated occupied with something in front of them. The steel ram hit the door lock with a force that sent the door inward so hard it cracked the doorstop on the wall behind it. And in the half-second before the team flooded through the threshold, Marcus heard the conversation inside stop, and heard a chair scrape, and heard a glass fall. And then there was no more hearing because the room was full of voices and movement, and the hard bright light of tactical flashlights. What Marcus saw when he cleared his sector and brought the room into focus was a tableau that was so complete in its implications that it took his professionally trained mind several seconds to process it. Not because it was complicated, but because it was almost too simple. 4 men at a table, and on the table, bundled and stacked, was money, and arranged around the money, like the supporting evidence in a case that was building itself, were personal items that did not belong to any of the 4 men sitting here, watches and rings, and a passport holder. The kinds of things that someone stopped on a dark highway might find if he searched thoroughly enough. Sheriff Dale Pruitt set down his bourbon glass with the slow, deliberate calm of a man buying time to think. And he looked at Marcus, and he looked at Okafor, and he looked at the FBI windbreakers, and he said, in the resonant political baritone he used at county commissioner meetings and press conferences, "You have made a very serious mistake tonight. Captain and I would encourage you very strongly to reconsider your next action before you make it substantially worse." Reyes stepped forward and placed a federal warrant in the middle of the money on the table, letting it land and lie there in the spilled ring from Pruitt's bourbon glass. And she said, "Read the header, Sheriff." Chief Deputy Leonard Voss gave up the safe combination after approximately 90 seconds of conversation with Reyes, because Voss was not ideologically committed to anything, had been operating on self-interest throughout, and was now calculating self-interest with the updated information available to him, and Marcus knelt at the floor safe and entered the 6 digits and heard the bolts retract and pulled the door open. The money he expected, tight bricks of mixed bills totaling, as it would later be counted, $283,000. But it was the items surrounding the cash that painted the true picture of what had been happening on Route 77 for 3 years. There were dozens of Ziploc bags filled with personal belongings, each labeled in black marker, each containing items that had been confiscated from people who had nothing to do with narcotics of any kind, and who had simply been in the wrong county on the wrong road at the wrong hour with cash that a man with a badge had decided was more his than theirs. Marcus went through the bags one by one, reading the labels, and the third from the top said, "Webb, James, Route 77, northbound, $6,800, refused, waiver threatened with trafficking." And inside the bag was a white envelope with the corner worn down. Marcus held the bag in both hands and looked at his brother's name written in Sharpie on the outside of it, written in the casual handwriting of a man to whom James Webb was nothing except a line in a ledger. And he stood there for a moment that nobody else in the room noticed, because everyone else was occupied with other things. And then he placed the bag in a clear evidence container with the same steady hands he had been using all night for everything else. By 6:45 in the morning, the sun was arriving slowly, and with a reluctance that suggested it hadn't fully committed to the day yet, laying long shadows across the courthouse square. And Marcus Webb stood on the front steps of the Oak Ridge County Courthouse with a paper cup of black coffee he had gotten from a machine in the lobby and watched the satellite trucks arrive. There were 7 of them by 7:15, with their reporters in the good coats they kept for significant occasions standing in the positions that would put the courthouse columns behind them, and the steps were shortly going to be very busy. The first wave came from the far end of the parking lot. 9 deputies from the day shift arriving for work at 7:30, walking in 1s and 2s with their coffee cups and their collective ignorance of what had happened between midnight and dawn, and the federal agents who met them did so with the brisk efficiency of people running a schedule, and the deputies were cuffed and processed before most of them had fully understood what was happening. Sheriff Dale Pruitt came down the courthouse steps in an orange federal jumpsuit at approximately 7:52, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals who matched his pace precisely, and a camera from the Atlanta affiliate caught the specific moment when Pruitt looked up and registered the press cameras and looked back down, and that image ran on every network in the state before 8 o'clock. Marcus Novak arrived at 8:15 in a gray sedan, and he had a lawyer with him, and he had come voluntarily. And when he saw Marcus on the courthouse steps, he stopped walking for a moment and then continued. And when he reached Marcus, he said, "I should have said something a long time before last night." And Marcus looked at him and said, "Yes, you should have," and then said, "But you're here now," and said nothing more, which was its own kind of accounting, calibrated carefully to be exactly what the situation deserved and nothing extra. Okafor came out of the courthouse at 8:20 and said the U.S. Attorney is filing the full indictments this morning. All 4 principal defendants, plus the 9 deputies and the Equal Justice Initiative, has already been contacted about the victim identification process, and Marcus said good and said what's next, and Okafor said the hard part, and Marcus said he knew. He looked south toward the highway for a moment toward the direction of Route 77 and mile marker 31, and the place where 3 years of nights had just run out, and then he walked back inside. The federal courthouse downtown was the kind of building that was designed to make you feel the weight of what happened inside it before you ever reached the door, all stone and height, and the specific permanence of a structure built by an institution that expects to still be standing in 200 years. And on the morning of Roy Callahan's sentencing hearing, the building was doing its job with particular effectiveness, because the people filing through the security line carried in their faces the specific quality of people who have been waiting a long time for a specific thing and are finally within an hour of it. Marcus Webb sat in the gallery on the left side of the courtroom, third row from the front, wearing a dark gray suit and a plain tie. And next to him sat James Webb, in a white button-down shirt with a collar that was slightly too tight the way dress shirt collars are when you don't wear them often. And James had not said anything since they had passed through security, except to note that the courthouse was larger than he had expected, which Marcus had agreed with. Roy Callahan, at the defendant's table, was a study in subtraction, 15 pounds gone. The tactical bulk of his uniform replaced by a gray suit that communicated nothing of what the uniform had communicated his color off, and his eyes carrying the specific exhausted flatness of someone who has spent 4 months in pretrial confinement, sleeping badly and thinking too much, and the confident ease with which he had moved through every room Marcus had ever seen him in was simply absent the way the furnishing of a room is absent after the room has been emptied. Behind Callahan in the gallery on the right, his wife Karen sat between her 2 daughters, both of them teenagers, and all 3 of them had the careful, composed expressions of people who have been crying recently and have decided that today they are not going to cry, at least not here. And Marcus registered them and then looked away, because what he felt looking at them was not satisfaction and not pity, but something more complicated than either. The 6 people who had been invited to deliver victim impact statements did so in an order that the U.S. Attorney's Office had sequenced with some care, beginning with those whose losses were most straightforwardly financial, and moving toward those for whom the losses had been of a different and harder to quantify kind. Earl Mosley went first, and he told the court about the night of the stop, and the waiver, and the envelope told it with the measured cadence of a man who had composed what he was going to say and thought seriously about what composure cost and what it bought. And he told them that his mother's surgery had gone well, that she had recovered, that the family had covered the costs through other means. And then he said that the money itself was not the thing he had come here to talk about. What he had come to talk about was the phone call he had made to his brother at 6 in the morning, when he had finally reached Georgia, the call in which he explained what had happened on the road and why he was arriving without the envelope, and the silence on his brother's end of that call, which was not the silence of blame, but something harder and sadder. The silence of recognition of a man hearing a story he had been expecting to hear his whole life about someone he loved. A silence that said, yes, this is the world we know. This is the world, and yet it still takes something from you every time it confirms itself. Dorothy Hines testified from a wheelchair, 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had been traveling to see her son when Callahan stopped her 18 months before the arrest, and she told the court that she had not driven after dark since that night, not once that her son had offered to come pick her up every time she needed to travel after sundown, and that she had accepted, had allowed herself to be rearranged by what had happened on that road, in ways that she had not chosen and could not entirely undo, and she looked at the judge and said, I was a schoolteacher for 38 years. I paid my taxes, I followed every rule I ever knew, and on Route 77 none of that was worth a single thing. James Webb was last, and he walked to the podium with his hands at his sides and his chin level, not performing composure but genuinely composed in the way that people are genuinely composed when they have decided they are not going to give the situation any more of themselves than they have already given. And he looked at the front wall of the courtroom above the judge's head and told his story in a voice that was even and direct and precise about its details. He talked about the down payment, about the 4 years of saving, about what it had meant to Patricia, his wife, who had picked out the house and who had been sitting at home that night waiting for him to call. and he talked about what he had said to her instead and what the conversation that followed had cost them, not the money but the certainty, the sense that there was a ground under them that would hold, and he said that you could recover the money that they had, slowly, that they had found another house and moved in 2 years later, and it was a good house, but that what you could not recover so easily was the feeling of safety on a public road at night, the feeling that the badge was what it was supposed to be. He looked at Callahan then for the first time during his statement, and he said, "I didn't report it when it happened, because I didn't believe anyone with a badge in Oak Ridge County would believe me over another badge. And I'm standing here now because I was wrong about that, and I want that to be on the record." Marcus looked at the table in front of him when James said it at the grain of the wood and his own folded hands, and he held what he was feeling in the careful, disciplined way he held most things, which was to acknowledge it and not perform it. And James walked back to his seat and sat down next to Marcus, and Marcus put his hand briefly on his brother's shoulder and then took it back, and neither of them said anything. The recording was played at 11:14 in the morning, the courtroom having been brought to the particular quality of silence that a federal proceeding generates when everyone in the room understands that something significant is about to happen, and the U.S. Attorney pressed play on the laptop connected to the courtroom sound system. The voice that came through the speakers was Roy Callahan's voice, and it filled the room with a completeness and a clarity that reminded everyone present that this had been said in the dark, on a road at 2 in the morning, in a place where Callahan had believed no record existed, and that the record had been made anyway. Smart people keep their money in banks, and only 2 kinds of people drive at 1 in the morning with 20 grand in a gym bag. People running from something or people carrying something, and either way tonight it becomes county property. 8 seconds of silence followed the end of the audio, during which the U.S. Attorney stood at the lectern without speaking or moving. In those 8 seconds, Marcus watched Earl Mosley. Earl was looking at his own hands, the wide, calloused hands that had shaken when he signed the waiver in the dark, and when the 8 seconds ended, Earl looked up slowly, and his expression was not anger and not grief, but something cleaner than either the look of a man watching an account finally come due. Dorothy Hines, in the wheelchair at the end of the gallery row, had both hands clasped tightly in her lap, and Marcus could see her knuckles from where he sat, and he understood that the phrase county property had done something specific to her when she heard it in this room, because it was the same phrase Callahan had used the night he stopped her. Then the U.S. Attorney said, in a voice modulated very precisely to be heard clearly, without rhetorical emphasis, "Ladies and gentlemen, those are not the words of a law enforcement officer exercising judgment in a difficult situation. Those are the words of a man who made a clear and conscious decision to use the authority given to him by the people of this state as a tool for taking from those people. And he made that decision not once but 41 documented times over a period of 3 years on the same stretch of road." Callahan's defense attorney made his final argument, which was competent and careful, and landed like rain on stone. And then Judge Whitfield asked if the defendant wished to make a statement, and Roy Callahan stood up, and he had prepared something Marcus could see that he had prepared, something could see the folded piece of paper in his hand. But when he looked out at the gallery and saw Earl Mosley and Dorothy Hines and James Webb and the others, the prepared thing seemed to rearrange itself into something he couldn't quite say, and what he said instead was a version of explanation dressed as remorse, a recitation of circumstances and pressures and the culture of the department. And then at the very end, almost without seeming to intend it, he said, "I wasn't the only one doing this. I was doing what everyone in that department was doing." The courtroom went very still. Judge Whitfield wrote something down on the pad in front of her. Marcus knew what she had written because he had heard Okafor say it on the phone after the statement was completed. Those last 9 words are going to open 3 more investigations. Judge Carol Whitfield had been on the federal bench for 11 years and had presided over a range of cases that encompassed enough of the human capacity for causing harm that she was not easily surprised or easily moved. and the particular quality of stillness with which she looked down at Roy Callahan when she began to speak was not coldness, but the opposite, a very specific and carefully maintained attention that she was choosing to express as precision. She addressed Callahan directly. She told him that what struck her most about this case after reading all the materials and hearing all the testimony was not the scale of it or the duration of it, but the ordinariness of it, the degree to which he had apparently integrated what he was doing into the structure of a normal working life, had pulled over a family man on his way to his mother's surgery, and taken the money his family had pooled for her care, and then driven back to his perch at mile marker 31 and waited for the next car. You believed Judge Whitfield set her voice dropping to a register that carried without effort to every corner of the courtroom that darkness and distance made you invisible on that road. You believed the badge made what you were doing something other than robbery. Detective Webb turned on the lights, and what those lights revealed was a man who had chosen deliberately and repeatedly to prey on people he believed had no recourse. She paused, and the pause was not for effect, but because what came next deserved its own air. You were wrong about the darkness, she said, and you were wrong about the recourse. She then read the sentence Roy Callahan on the charges of Hobbs Act extortion deprivation of rights under color of law, across 47 counts, armed robbery and conspiracy, 24 years in a federal correctional institution, no parole eligibility forfeiture of the entire pension fund of $290,000, forfeiture of the property identified in the proceeds analysis as having been purchased with extortion money, and restitution of $342,000 to the 47 identified victims to be paid in full. She announced that Sheriff Dale Pruitt would receive 31 years, that Judge Robert Aldridge would receive 18 years and permanent disbarment from the practice of law, that Commissioner Frank Bellamy would receive 9 years reduced on the basis of cooperation. When the gavel came down, the sound was the same flat authoritative crack it made every day in this room for motions and rulings of no particular weight. But in this room on this afternoon it registered differently, registered as something that had been building for a very long time and had arrived at its proper destination. The marshals came to Callahan, and he stood and turned, and they put the restraints on him, and he moved with them toward the side door of the courtroom. And just before the door opened, he turned and looked back at the gallery, in the way that people sometimes look back at rooms they are leaving for the last time. And his eyes found Karen and his daughters, and what crossed his face in that moment was the look of a man who understands at the precise moment it is too late for understanding to change anything exactly what he has thrown away. James Webb, sitting beside Marcus, watched Callahan go through the door, and when the door closed, he exhaled long and slow, the breath of someone releasing a thing they have been holding for 2 years and 3 months. And Marcus sat with him in the quiet of that exhale and did not fill it with anything. Roy Callahan was processed into USP Atlanta on a Wednesday in February, arriving on a federal transport bus that pulled through the outer gate at 9:17 in the morning, under a sky the color of dirty concrete. And the intake procedure was thorough and efficient, and designed to communicate in the language of institutional process, rather than words that the person who had stepped off the bus and the person who had lived the life that brought them here were two different people now. His clothes were taken. He was given a uniform. The officer handing it across the counter did not look at him in any particular way, was simply doing the next thing in the sequence of intake. And this indifference was its own kind of statement, because Roy Callahan had built his entire career on the assumption that the uniform he wore commanded a specific form of attention and a specific form of deference, and the man across the counter at USP Atlanta gave him neither. He was assigned the number 94721-017, and the process of becoming that number rather than the name he had carried for 46 years took less than 40 minutes and required no particular effort from anyone. In his cell on the first night on a mattress that was thin in the specific way that institutional mattresses are thin, Callahan lay in the dark and thought about the thing he had said to Earl Mosley on the shoulder of Route 77, said in the conversational, confident tone of a man who held all the power in the situation, "Smart people keep their money in banks, and only two kinds of people drive at 1 in the morning with 20 grand in a gym bag." He thought about Earl Mosley's hands on the steering wheel, and about James Webb's signature on a waiver in the dark, and about Dorothy Hines, who had not driven after dark in a year and a half because of something he had done. And he lay in the dark with that awareness, and there was no comfort in it, and no relief and no diminishment of it that time was going to provide. In the morning before the lights came fully up, he reached for his chest in the automatic way he had reached for his chest every morning for 18 years, the reflexive confirmation that the badge was there, and found nothing but prison fabric over sternum. And he held his hand there for a moment, flat against the place where the badge had been, and then he took it away. 6 months after the sentencing hearing on a Thursday evening in August, when the light stayed long enough to still be something, at 7 o'clock, 2 workers from the County Utilities Department set the final bolts on the second of 2 new light poles at mile marker 31 on Route 77, and the foreman flipped the circuit breaker, and the light that came on was the steady practical white of LED road, lighting the kind of light that makes a road look like what it is, a public surface available to everyone, visible to anyone. The Equal Justice Initiative, working alongside the U.S. Attorney's Office, identified 51 people who had been extorted on Route 77 in the period, covered by Pruitt's ledger, 4 more than the 47 confirmed during the trial, and all 51 received restitution checks for the exact amount listed in the ledger against their names, plus 8% annual interest calculated from the date of the stop, and the total figure was $412,000 returned to people who had earned it legitimately and had it taken from them in the dark. Earl Mosley received a check for $4,722, the original $4,200 plus the interest, and he deposited $4,000 into his mother's medical expense account and kept the remaining $722 in an envelope in the top drawer of his desk at the plant, not spending it and not throwing it away, keeping it there, the way you keep something that stands for something else, something you want to be able to reach for and confirm is still there. On a Thursday night in late August, 6 months after the sentence, a pickup truck with Virginia plates drove south on Route 77 at 11:45 in the evening, doing 57 miles an hour in the 55 zone, and the new light poles at mile marker 31 lit the road ahead clearly, and the driver passed the spot where the gravel shoulder had once held the weight of a deputy's cruiser, and nothing happened, which was the whole point, which was everything that had been fought for and proven in a federal courtroom, and the truck drove on down the road, and the taillights grew smaller and disappeared, and the road was empty and lit and quiet. Marcus parked his own car on the street in front of James's house on a Saturday afternoon in September, and he looked at the house through the windshield for a moment before he got out. James and Patricia had moved in 4 months ago, and the house was modest and solid and genuinely theirs, and what Marcus thought about when he looked at it was the simple physical reality of the lit windows, which meant that inside someone was home, and someone was safe, and the light was on. He picked up the tablet from the passenger seat and opened the secure folder that Okafor had shared with him 2 days ago, the preliminary file on a developing pattern in a county 200 miles west. 8 reported stops in 6 months, all black male drivers traveling alone on a state highway between midnight and 4 in the morning, all involving cash seizures, all with formal complaints that had been filed and closed within 72 hours. And the pattern was familiar in every way that mattered, wore the same shape as everything he had spent the last 14 months pursuing, the same grammar, the same assumption that certain people on certain roads at certain hours were available to be taken from with impunity. Marcus read through what was there and thought about mile marker 31, and about Earl Mosley sitting on the shoulder in the dark, and about James at his kitchen table. And he ran the calculation one more time, the one about what it cost and what it was worth, and whether the answer came out the same when you ran it again, and it came out the same. He called Okafor, and she picked up on the second ring, and he said, "I read the file," and she said, and he said, "I'll take the assignment," and she said, "I'll have the vehicle ready Monday," and he said, "Good." Marcus sat in the car for another minute, looking at the lit windows of his brother's house, and then he started the engine and pulled away from the curb and turned toward the highway. And the night came up around the car the way night comes up on roads like Route 77, complete and immediate, and full of the particular silence of a country that is never entirely what it promises to be, and never entirely without the people trying to hold it to its promises, and Marcus Webb drove into it. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real about what accountability looks like when someone refuses to look away, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this one only reach the people who need them when someone passes them along. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Because there are more of these stories, more roads, more people who stood in the dark and refused to give up, and we are going to tell every single one of them.